In part one, I've shown you a video from one of the perhaps thousands of psychiatric documentaries that I've referenced in my videos alone, not to mention all that I've seen. And I've shown you how a guy, they assumed that he was anxious. What he kept saying over and over again. And I'm going to tell you exactly why he kept saying this over and over again, and how absurd it is for them to drug him for it. First of all, he was taken in there for uncontrolled yelling. Now, some of you will say, well, there is such a thing as controlled yelling. What about when parents, discipline their children? Hey, don't do that kind of thing, right? Well, there's a difference between raising your voice and yelling. Show me someone who's never yelled uncontrollably themselves, at least for a certain amount of time, and show me someone who's never seen their parents yell at each other, who actually live with both parents. Growing up, I've seen it quite frequently. When you're mad, you want to yell. Symptoms of anger are not a symptom of a mental disorder. It is a symptom of something wrong in your life. Okay? Now, when somebody is saying, I don't like this place, the medicines don't work, that's a symptom of somebody being treated unfairly, who feels like no one is listening to him, and he's going into his own zone. Nothing to do with biological dysfunction. Nothing to do with, quote-unquote, mental illnesses as described by them. Yes, the symptoms of being treated unfairly happen to overlap with many of the symptoms of what they are attempting to describe as the symptoms of mental illness. They have you see how either they're stupid or they're playing stupid. But what should never happen is that someone such as myself, and believe me, I could have said this 18 years ago when I first started studying psychiatry. No, it's now 19 years ago. So about 20 years ago. I could have said this when I first started. This should never happen. A 13-year-old child should never be able to say what's going on with the patient consistently better than quote-unquote educated professionals, psychiatrists. It should never happen, ever. Especially in a system where we frequently give them the power and the right to judge, to drug people. That should never occur. Don't you see? And this is not even my case. Imagine how much better I know than they do about my case. This is someone else's case. And when you hear my explanation, it is far more rational and logical than theirs. Do they have any brain scans to back up their insanity? No. Do they have any valid diagnostic tests to back up their insanity? No. So what we're talking about is someone's judgment call on why someone is behaving a certain way. See how ridiculous that is? That's like we're in a classroom, right? And we sit down, we hear the teacher, he's very passionate, and at the end, there's 5 of us, and we sit down, we talk about the teacher. One of us says, this guy's a fucking nutbag. He needs to get he needs some fucking drugs, he needs some Ativan. He needs some anxiety medication. He's a fucking nut. And another one says, well, he's very passionate. I didn't get that, I didn't take that from the lecture at all. He's very passionate. He's very logical. Another one says, yeah, I agree with you. And the other one says, no, I agree with George or whatever. He's fucking nuts. You see what I'm saying? There's different perceptions. It's very subjective. There's no objective test. And also, it's subjective over whether he's a threat. Well, he's yelling uncontrollably. We're afraid of what he might do. So we called the cops. And now he goes to the psych ward, loses his guns right from the normal human reaction. Probably will never get his gun rights back, ever. He's in the system. And I've proven this beyond any doubt. There's a very great possibility that if he refuses medications, the system will watch him more. They will stalk him, and they will start covertly drugging him. That's a distinct possibility. All over subjective bullshit. And of course, it's all points of view. If you look at something from a Christian point of view, for example, See, this boy needs Jesus. The same person looking at it from a mental health, psychiatrist perspective will say, this person needs Ativan. The same person looking at it from a eugenics fucking Hitler perspective, this person needs a bullet in his fucking head. You see what I'm saying? And we can't even be judged by people who look at it from our perspective. In trial, you're judged by a jury of your peers. The idea is that before you're judged and punished in society, that perhaps you can at least have your case reflected on, studied by those who perhaps see things at least somewhat the same way as you do. Because that is what we consider fair, or at least close to it. But in mental health, we are never, ever judged by someone who sees things the same way as we do. Those of us who disagree with the diagnosis, that is. Can you imagine being a Democrat and being judged by a Republican who already can tell pretty quickly that you don't see things like they do? Now, especially imagine if you're running in a race. Imagine if Donald Trump could judge Ben Carson, whether or not he has a psychiatric illness. He's like, oh, that's a no-brainer. He's mentally ill. Take him out of the race. There goes the political opposition. I mean, there's so many factors in this. The government has vested interest with psychiatry to drug political dissidents. I mean, that's a no-brainer. So not only are we judged by people who don't look at life from our perspective, but they have vested interest with different groups to drug us. If you're the average person, they have vested interest with Big Pharma to drug you and make a profit and have a new patient brought into the greater mental health system. Now, all psychiatrists have vested interest. Because say you go to one psychiatrist, say you move to fucking Virginia or something. Now you're seeing another psychiatrist. So every psychiatrist potentially could make money off you. So when you're labeled, they have vested interest with the government and the law enforcement who wants to see everyone drugged, because they don't understand that psychiatric pills cause most of these mass shootings. So they are dumb enough to think that if everyone's drugged up, no one's going to be violent toward them, when it's actually the opposite in many cases. So all these groups, and they treat you unfairly, and they will never concede my points because they're selfish, because they're evil. And I talk about feminists who talk about sovereignty over their body, but there's a feminist perspective in psychology, and many psychiatrists, logically, are feminists as well. So they're force medicating people all the time. People who call themselves feminists are force medicating people all the time. Feminists in gangs, in prison gangs, are forcing women to have sex with them all the time. Feminists in the army are turning a blind eye to rape all the time. Feminist officers all the time. Feminists in the police, in the FBI, in intelligence community are turning a blind eye on people's sovereignty being taken away from them without due process, without a logical reason. But yet they cry about sovereignty over their body. Let's not forget, they advocate pro-choice. So even when it kills somebody else, they advocate sovereignty over their body. Because they're not necessarily concerned with women, they're concerned with their body. They're not necessarily concerned with sovereignty over people's bodies, they're concerned with their body. And they're in a position in society where they expect that if things go their way, that for them personally, they'll have more control over their body. Not women in general, not people in general. See the hypocrisy here? And gays go on and on about how people shouldn't judge them for their different, or shouldn't assume that there's something wrong with them, or they're possessed by devils, all of which are different perspectives to look at things that society has never had a consensus on. And I would go as far as to say people who aren't diagnosed as mentally ill have never had a consensus on. Society has never agreed on these things. But yet, the rich, the oppressive, that's why I say, don't ever think that an atheist, a racist, a feminist, a Satanist, the LGBT community or the worst criminals are somehow revolutionary. It's absurd. They're not going against the 1%. They enforce the philosophies, sentiments, values, ideologies of the 1%. And they do it because of what's in their personal interest, personal gain. They're supporting white occult gain for their personal gain. They're supporting Zionist occult gain for their personal gain. See how sick that is? Even right now, while I'm making this video, they are covertly gassing me. And I don't have many options. Just like many quote-unquote mental patients. You know? Can we all afford to live somewhere else? So when we live with somebody, after we've been thoroughly disenfranchised and stigmatized by mental health, our friends in our family, who may pretend to be sympathetic, but as soon as they're mad at you, as soon as it's in their best interest, well, you know, you're a crazy person, you know, what you have to say matter? So that, as soon as you've been diagnosed, you know, psychologically, you feel more helpless. In actuality, you are more helpless and less likely to get a job. So they have oppressed you. And if you're a political activist, they have repressed you. They have kept you down. They have, I go as far as to say they persecuted you to a certain degree. Just because they haven't gone as far as they have with me doesn't mean they haven't persecuted you for your beliefs. It's exactly what it is. So your beliefs and your behaviors. So then you are more likely to be stuck in a halfway house with your parents and some kind of living situation where the people who aren't diagnosed with mental illness have inordinate control over the situation, including your life. So then they say, well, you know, we're going to kick you out if you don't take drugs, and so on and so forth, or you don't have the money to move out. So they have a captive victim base in different places of captivity all over the nation, be it mental hospitals, be it psych wards, be it prisons, be it halfway houses, be it outpatient institutions, be it their own family's home. I mean, these people are completely evil. They're hypocrites. And it's very sad. The day when they claim that they have valid evidence, that is when you should be the most afraid. Because any argument that can be made, they've been made in Alaska, in courtrooms all over America, where they say psychiatry, there's a viable argument that psychiatry doesn't know what they're talking about, and this isn't how we should be treating people in the first place. As soon as these people claim that they have concrete evidence, which, by the way, doesn't mean anything, because all they will show is that in certain areas of the brain, if the brain scan is looking like this, and there's certain, you know, black parts or certain dots or whatever the case may be in certain parts of the scan, that this is more likely to mean that this person is going to behave this way. That's all it would show. Period. And even when they have that, even if you could prove that this person is schizophrenic, this person is depressed, almost all of these quote-unquote patients are conscious to a certain degree. Isn't it their choice? You know? Isn't it their choice? Do we force cripples to always, you know, sit in their chair? Sit in your chair. You know? Here's a blanket, sleep in your chair. Or is it their choice to wobble out of their chair sometimes? It's their choice. Especially if we're going to call it helping them function. It's their choice. Leave them alone. If they want to fucking hear voices, let them hear voices. If they want to be fucking depressed, let them be depressed. If they want to have mood swings, let them have mood swings. It's their life. It's their experiences. It's their choice. Leave them alone, you sicko control freaks. Because if you don't, then I will start taking away your choices as well. In part one, I've shown you a video from one of the perhaps thousands of psychiatric documentaries that I've referenced in my videos alone. Not to mention all that I've seen. And I've shown you how a guy, they assumed that he was anxious. What he kept saying over and over again. And I'm going to tell you exactly why he kept saying this over and over again. And how absurd it is for them to drug him for it. First of all, he was taken in there for uncontrolled yelling. Now, some of you will say, well, but what should never happen is that someone such as myself, and believe me, I could have said this 18 years ago when I first started studying psychiatry. No, it's now 19 years ago. So about 20 years ago. I could have said this when I first started. This should never happen. A 13-year-old child should never be able to say what's going on with the patient consistently better than quote-unquote educated professionals, psychiatrists. It should never happen. Ever. Oh, there is such a thing as controlled yelling. What about when parents, discipline their children? Hey, don't do that kind of thing, right? Well, there's a difference between raising your voice and yelling. Show me someone who's never yelled uncontrollably themselves, at least for a certain amount of time, and show me someone who's never seen their parents yell at each other, who actually live with both parents. Growing up, I've seen it quite frequently. Then to do with biological dysfunction. Nothing to do with quote-unquote mental illnesses as described by them. Yes, the symptoms of being treated unfairly happen to overlap with many of the symptoms of what they are attempting to describe as the symptoms of mental illness. They have you see how either they're stupid or they're playing stupid. When you're mad, you want to yell. Symptoms of anger are not a symptom of a mental disorder. It is a symptom of something wrong in your life. Okay? Now, when somebody is saying, I don't like this place, the medicines don't work, that's a symptom of somebody being treated unfairly, who feels like no one is listening to him, and he's going into his own zone. Nothing.